Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. I want to talk now about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We use the word aggregate to refer to all demand and all supply for all the products and services produced by a country in a year, essentially GDP. What's the demand for GDP and what's the supply of GDP? These are major and fundamental building blocks to this class, because as we move further and further into this area of macroeconomics, most of the time, as a reference point, when we're talking about theory and models, we have to use an aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph to represent what's going on with an economy. So in a few minutes, I'm going to show you how I expect you to show that picture, a graph of an entire economy. One other kind of picture, of course, is the circular flow. That is a way to visualize how products and services through different markets are flowing both within a country and outside a country if there are international markets. But we're going to talk about the way we can use a graph to represent the same general kinds of ideas. Before we do that, though, now that we've talked about the difference between nominal and real incomes, nominal and real GDP, you're ready to hear about a pair of graphs that also illustrate the difference between nominal and real, the graphs that refer to the markets for money. The money market is the nominal version of the market for money. The loanable funds market is the real version. When I say real version, what I mean is more long-term, when prices, specifically inflation and deflation, can have an impact on the true value of that money. So we have to remember that nominal GDP or national income is only what we see, but real GDP or national income is what we actually get. It's the same thing in the markets for money. So as we get further and further into the terms that people agree to before they have a plan to return money or pay back loans in particular, then the impact of inflation in that long term starts to kind of rear its head. And depending on who you are, inflation may or may not be a good thing, depending on whether you're the borrower or you're the person who gave that loan. But we'll come back to that later. Right now I just want to keep it simple and show you how to graph these two markets. So as you've probably begun to realize, it's really important that you practice doing these things, putting stylus to computer screen or pen to paper as much as possible. And so I recommend that you follow along with this. And as you've also found out, some of you have omitted these things and you may have been penalized points for it. You need to be in the habit of titling your graphs. So in this case, I haven't handwritten them, but we have the titles ready to go. When you're doing this as a response to a question or a prompt on a test, quiz, whatever, make sure you handwrite the title of your graph. So on the left-hand side, we have the money market, of course, and we're going to go once again to review, start inking, and set up our two axes. Same thing for the loanable funds market. And as you'll recall, whenever we're going to graph a market, on the left-hand side, that axis is labeled price, and then down below is quantity. So we can go ahead and put quantity now. In both markets. But we want to be as specific as possible with our labels for price. And of course, if you stop and think about the price of money, if I'm going to loan you money, we refer to the price of that loan as interest. So for both of these axes, we're going to reference interest. For the money market, in this class, what you have to remember is that these are very short-term loans, typically for less than 1 year. So the money is repaid, or it's looking at a very short-term process, which we consider to be less than 1 year. And if it's less than 1 year, of course, then inflation, if there is any, is going to have much less of an impact than it would have otherwise. Of course, if you think back to your lessons about inflation, the CPI, deflation, and so forth, most of the time we're talking about a basis of measuring inflation from 1 year to the next, not necessarily within a year or on a quarterly basis, a weekly basis. All that stuff is going to fall within the loanable funds market. You know, all of the impacts of inflation, since they're looking at more than 1 year, would also have the impact on the loanable funds market, and so that is inclusive of loans that have a maturity date of more than 1 year. In other words, if you're going to take a loan from somebody that's somewhere out there in this market for loans, and that loan needs to be more than a year. Let's say I need to take out a loan to buy a car, for a college education, to buy a home. Those loans are typically not paid back in a year or less time. You wouldn't find the market for those technically in the money market. That's the loanable funds market. All right, so now that we know the term of money for each of these, we can have a more intelligent way of labeling those axes. So since the money market is short term, it is going to have a price, an interest rate that is purely nominal. We can just say whatever the number is the number, and so this axis is labeled NIR, which stands for nominal interest rate. All right. Also, remind yourself that when you're graphing anything, try to use abbreviations as much as possible, because especially as there starts to become movement in certain scenarios and you use your graphs to answer your questions, they can become quite cluttered. Just use your legend as the place to define all of these things. The standard definition of most of these abbreviations are things that the AP graders are going to know, but you have to prove that you know what they are. You don't want to do that within the body of your graph, so use your legends. Now the loanable funds market, of course, because it's more than 1 year, needs to factor out inflation, and we need to look at what the interest rate is in a real sense. So the label for that is RIR. You guessed it, real interest rate, not just the nominal number like we have in the money market. Now, because the money market is short term, and we'll talk a little bit more about why this is the case later, the supply curve in the money market is labeled SM sub 1. It's the supply of money, which is inflexible in the short term, doesn't change. So that curve goes straight up and down. The demand curve for money in the money market is just like a demand curve for so many other things that you've seen already. That is DM sub 1. When we go over to the loanable funds market, this looks more like a market that you've become familiar with. Whether the curves are truly curved or they're straight lines doesn't matter, but you have the supply of loanable funds, S sub LF1, and you have the demand for loanable funds, D LF sub 1. And then, of course, just like with any other market, you're going to have an equilibrium point where you start. Now, the equilibrium point in this class is abbreviated in the money market as little I sub 1, just plain old interest. And then down below for the equilibrium quantity, we put Q sub 1. We're going to do the same thing over here in the loanable funds market. The abbreviation for the interest rate in the real, in the loanable funds market, because it's a real interest rate, is little r sub 1. And so that's how you graph these. And of course you need legends. So we put all those things down below or off to the side. NIR refers to nominal interest rate, RIR refers to real interest rate, little I sub 1 is where we start, and so that's the initial nominal interest rate. Little r sub 1 is the initial real interest rate. Q sub 1 is the initial quantity of money. Q sub 1 in this graph is the initial quantity of loanable funds. Then just a couple more labels. Over in the money market, this is the initial supply of money. Over here is the initial supply of loanable funds. DM sub 1 is the initial demand for money. DLF sub 1 is the initial demand for loanable funds. And let's see, did we forget anything? Well, you can always put quantity. So this is the quantity of money. This is the quantity of loanable funds. And we've got what we need. We've labeled the interest rate in a general term, but also specifically where we're starting. And same thing with quantity and each of the curves. Now, of course, this can be pretty tedious. The more you do it, the more tedious it becomes. But you really need to take the time, even though it's time consuming, to do this as a habit. When I have a class in front of me, a very typical response is, when I ask them to do an exercise where they have to graph stuff, is, do we need a legend? Do we need a legend? Because it becomes very tedious. And sometimes people complain. I'm fine with that for the most part. But when a test comes in my class, or more importantly, the AP exam comes, they feel like, wow, because I had to do that legend so many times, I knew those graphs, and I knew what the graphs were communicating, more importantly, frontwards and backwards. And they're very grateful. So be in the habit of using legends, and you're going to know your stuff that much better. Now, this seems a little bit tedious, but we haven't even shifted any of these curves. Of course, if I gave you a situation and I said, all right, draw a picture of the loanable funds market and show what changes take place if such and such a factor kicks in. Let's say that something happens to increase the demand for loanable funds. Well, of course, what you're going to want to do is show that change. Let's say you decide your curve is going to move this much. That's going to lead to a new equilibrium point, and you're not going to forget to use 3 arrows to show the change. But you now have a DLF sub 2, an R sub 2, and a Q sub 2, and all of those labels have to be added to your new legend. So that's, of course, even more tedious, but it's the reality with this class. Leave no stone unturned, and you'll really know your stuff well. Okay? Now, that's why, of course, all of these sub 1s, the I sub 1, the R sub 1, the Q's sub 1, SM sub 1, DLF sub 1, all of them start with the word initial in your legend, because we're kind of expecting that there's going to be some kind of change. All right, so if you want to use the word initial or starting nominal interest rate, starting supply of loanable funds, whatever, that's up to you. You might have some situations in this class where there is no change in either graph. That would be a little bit unusual, in which case you can just put real interest rate instead of initial real interest rate. But if you scan through an entire question and kind of see what's going to be expected of you, you'll know how to start properly. If you scan an entire question and you say, you know what, there's not going to be any change happening in either one of these markets, I can just call them real interest rate, quantity of loanable funds, forget about initial and final, then good for you. But most of the time you're going to have a change, and when you label these new places that we go in these markets, or for that matter the aggregate supply and demand graph, you're going to have these final resting places, so to speak, with that term. So over here we'd have R sub 2 be labeled final or new real interest rate. Now I'm not going to label all the other changes. I'm not going to add those to the legend because that's just going to eat up some time here, and I want to get on to aggregate supply and aggregate demand, but you know what I'm talking about. All right, you're going to have a new Q sub 1, and you're going to put final, and you're going to have DLF. Oops, I messed up the Q. Let's go back. Q sub 2, and you're going to put final or new for each of these. And these are just two of so many different markets for things that are bought and sold in our country and other countries. So, that being said, let's look at all demand and all supply, also known as aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So this is a way to show a picture of an entire economy. You want to be labeling them as such, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. All right, but knowing about so many of the different markets that make up our economy, we're going to discuss a really comprehensive graph now that shows a lot of the ways that we measure our economic health in our country and in other countries, and a lot of the concepts that we've discussed are going to be combined in that graph with a couple of other concepts. Now, these diagrams that we already have in the notes aren't complete. They don't have all the labels that I'm going to ask you to be in the habit of including with your graphs, but they're a good starting point, and they can emphasize the fact that there's really three states that an economy can be in that you can show using an aggregate supply and demand graph. One is in long-run equilibrium. As you'll see, we have a long-run aggregate supply curve, a short-run aggregate supply curve, and then just aggregate demand. And if in the short run, where short-run aggregate supply and demand intersect, happens to be right on LRAS, we are on what's called long-run equilibrium. Or in other words, we're at our potential. It's kind of like with the production possibilities frontiers that we covered earlier on. Being at a point along that curve means being at our potential. It's the same thing here. Now, in B here, you'll see that this is a recessionary gap, or what we call a recession, because where we are in this situation currently, where SORAS and AD intersect, is not at potential. It's not at LRAS. We'll explain a little bit more about how this, is and what the detail is behind the graph. But just understand for now that that's the way that you would show a recession. And then down here in C, in the short term or short run, if we're in an inflationary gap, we're temporarily operating beyond our potential. It's not something that's going to last unless the economy truly grows. It would look like this. So you would have SORAS and AD intersecting to the right of LRAS. Now what I'm going to do below this is show you how I expect you to graph a picture of the economy. Let's just say we're at our potential. So what we're going to do is have a picture of the economy where SRAS and AD intersect right along that LRAS curve, what I'll call the asterisk or the Christmas tree position. If it looks like that, one of those two shapes roughly, then that's good news for us as an economy. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by labeling this. I want to go back to black. The two colors that you can use on the AP exam in the free response section are black and blue. And so what I'd actually like you to do is be in the habit of drawing your original graph in black, your starting point, your initial place, just like we do with markets. I want to do the same thing with aggregate supply and demand. Draw in black pen and then show all your changes in blue. So that's why I'm changing back. Let's say this is a picture then of the US economy. And we are in long-run equilibrium. This is going to look different than what we just saw. And one example is putting a sub 1 below almost all of your labels. That's because you're almost always going to have some kind of change, and it's not going to be for another few chapters that you're going to see how and when LRAS is going to move, but eventually that's going to move. We're going to show ways that an economy can grow and talk about ways that we can expand our potential, but for the next several lessons, we're not going to be moving LRAS. It's just a way to prepare you for that possibility. Then we have short-run aggregate supply. Aggregate means all, as well as aggregate demand, and they have a sub 1 as well. So don't forget those. You can lose points in this class if you don't do it the way that I've trained you. Now, since we're talking about all prices, this is the U.S. economy. We're not just going to put price. We're going to put price level, which of course is measured in many different ways. You've spent the most time with the CPI. There are other. You don't have to put these labels in when you're graphing. PPI, the real GDP deflator, right? There's all different kinds of ways that we can signify the price level, but that doesn't have to be part of the way that you label your graph. But price level is along the left-hand axis. Down here is also quantity. Oops. But it's not the quantity of loanable funds. It's not the quantity of eyeglasses. It's the quantity of all stuff. And what term do we use to refer to all stuff? Right, GDP. Or, more importantly, real GDP. Now, where we are currently as an economy is going to be labeled PL sub 1 and Q sub 1. There's a couple of other labels, though, that I want you to include under LRAS. This is independent of where Q sub 1 is. If we're in a recession, a recessionary gap, Q sub 1 is going to be over here, because that's to the left of LRAS is where SRAS and AD are going to intersect. If we happen to be in an inflationary gap, Q sub 1 is going to be directly below that intersection point, which is to the right of LRAS. But all of this stuff I'm about to show you under LRAS signifies our potential or our natural place in the long run. So what could we use to signify all of the stuff that is going to be evident in an economy if we happen to be in long-run equilibrium at our potential? Well, we should be at our natural unemployment rate for the U.S. economy. Historically, it's somewhere between 4 and 5%. We should be at our natural income level. Y refers to income. We should also be at our natural level of output. Q signifies output. We should be at our natural level of employment. So you would think naturally it would be E sub n, but that's not the way it's signified. Don't blame me, I'm not the person that creates all these labels. We think of full employment and give it this label, F sub E. So that's all good stuff that we are striving for. We want to be at the natural level of unemployment, the natural level of income, the natural level of output of real GDP, full employment, all of that stuff. And you're going to want to, of course, use a legend to label all of this stuff. So when you come over to the side or down below, you're going to say PL sub 1, of course, is the initial price level. Q sub 1 is the initial quantity of real GDP for this economy, right? SRAS should be over here, AD should be over here, sub 1, LRAS should be over here. You're going to have all those definitions. You're also going to have U sub n, which is natural unemployment. Y sub n, which is natural income. Q sub N, which is natural output, and F sub E, which is full employment. Just kind of limited in space here with the notes. So even though I'm not showing LRAS, SRAS, and AD in my legend, you're expected to. Of course, this is just a starting point. We're going to talk later about factors that can shift these curves, AD and SRAS, and then what would that do to prices? What would that do to the quantity of real GDP in that economy? And what's fun is when you start to learn these things, you can almost begin to predict the future. I could say, so let's say that one of the inputs that most producers use in the United States, oil, experiences a price increase. What's going to happen? Well, you could say, you gave me a big hint there, Mr. Gideon. The suppliers are who you're talking about, so I'm guessing the supply curve is going to be the one that shifts. You use your same checklist as you did with markets. You ask yourself, which curve is going to shift, which way, draw it on your graph, and then read your graph. So if you're in a good habit of doing that, it shouldn't be difficult, and you say, all right, so if because oil prices are going to increase and the use of oil is really important in a lot of businesses out there, a lot of suppliers use that as an input, then I think supply is going to increase. That would be wrong. Because if the price of oil increases, these suppliers have less resources to put into production. So let's take that away. Let's draw what really happens. SRAS, or the supply of all products and services produced in a year in a country, is going to decrease. And you show that shift to the left. You also show a new equilibrium point, PL sub 2. You show, as part of that equilibrium point, Q sub 2. And of course, 3 arrows to indicate movement. And what's going to happen to all prices, ceteris paribus, if this one thing changes? Chances are all prices are going to go up. That's what your graph is saying. And that the quantity of products and services that the U.S. produces is going to decrease. And you would be able to answer a free response question by saying those things. One of the nice things about this class on the AP exam is in the free response question section, you don't have a whole lot of physical writing to do. You have quite a bit of graphing and labeling to do, and then you have to explain relatively briefly what your graph is showing. And that sometimes, most of the time in fact, only consists of a couple of sentences. So it's not like other AP social studies classes where you have to write until your hand gets numb because you've got a ton of information you've got memorized about history and you've got to just regurgitate it. It's very different. It's a lot more comprehension, understanding, and being able to explain what you illustrate with your graphs. Of course, if there was some kind of a change like it's indicated on this graph, then you're going to have to add to your legend, and so you would have to say PL sub 2. What does that mean? Well, that's the new price level, right? And Q sub 2, what's that? That's the new or final quantity of real GDP. SRAS sub 2 is the new or final short-run aggregate supply. All of those things need to be in your legend. So that's how to graph a picture of the entire economy, whether it's the US or Sweden or whatever country is named in the question. Make sure whatever country it is, you always label that at the top. And then when you're asked to draw an aggregate supply and demand graph, make sure that your starting point is always in the correct place. If it's a recession, then in black you're going to have AD and SRAS intersecting to the left of the RAS. If it's an inflationary gap that the economy is in as a starting point, they're going to intersect to the right of the RAS. If they happen to already be at their full potential, good for them. They're going to intersect in the Christmas tree position. So that's how to start off showing graphs of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And next we're going to get into a little more depth about what these things really are.